We know that Ubuntu is an Ubuntu Bantu term for humanity, the whole idea of being the self through others, and how we come to this humanist. Now, as also others have noted, right, including Tamale, we look at this as a traditional ideology of justice and fairness, but it's grounded in indigenous philosophies of good humanist, communitarianism, solidarity, and interdependence. And to me, the point here is that why I don't want to confuse the sociology of knowledge with the critical epistemology. The fact is that the rich African intellectual traditions of Ubuntu philosophy was born out of African struggles, resistance, and liberation. And it has been advanced within an anti-capitalist and counter-colonial lens. As a philosophy of practice, Ubuntu advances critical African scholarship to upend our mental and intellectual enslavement. Clearly, it also acknowledges the dialectics of theory and social practice, while we engage the African body as a site of knowing, as a site and place of action. When it comes to the African Black experience, right, the question has always been, how do we assert the locus of control over our story and how we tell our stories, implicating our identities, our histories and cultures, and our lived experiences. And this is why, to me, I've always made this point, and in one of the pieces I wrote to one of my students, I talk about the importance of vocalizing our politics with an adherence to the fact that why we say to know is to act. To me, to know is to act politically and responsibly. That the African Black scholar must deploy a spiritual remembrance of the Ubuntu saying, quote, I am because we are, and because we are, therefore I am. So framing a positionality, I think to me, to find and articulate a centeredness, as Amy Cesare, Malifiasanti, others have talked about, finding one center, a centeredness in conversations about Africanness, Blackness, and Euro modernity in order to build the solidarities that I'm talking about for new Afro features. We need an intersectional centric analysis that encapsulates the specificities of Black diasporic experiences as well as the historical connections with the motherland. We know Blackness is race, but it's also cultural, political, and social historical construction, which is experienced differently on African bodies in different geospaces and contexts. In particular, the African Black experience in white supremacist fascist context highlights the importance of these notions about color, body image, representation, culture, identity, and politics, and how they conflict, and there's a confluence. So while complicating understandings of Black community in terms of being complex, multifaceted, it's also filled with tensions and is contested, I would argue that we must still hold on to its political and spiritual force of coming to a collective Black African humanhood.
I'd like to take this time to acknowledge that those who are gathered here at the Delimiting Learning Institute. I want to welcome you as well for joining us in person. We are in Mi'kmaq, the ancestral and unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq people. This land is governed by the treaties of peace and friendship, first signed in 1726. It is important to remember that we are on land that was never surrendered. We offer this land acknowledgement in part to honor truth and reconciliation. In the same spirit, we wish to acknowledge our Black African Nova Scotian ancestors who came before us and paved the path for us to travel. We recognize the 400 plus years history of the communities of African and the African descent and the 52 communities in Nova Scotia of African descent and throughout this region. Our ancestors experienced disparities, but taught us never to give up and to care for one another. We will preserve just as they did. We stand in solidarity with our Indigenous brothers and sisters. We have a wonderful evening planned for you today, and I'm sure you'll be able to engage and you'll be inspired by what we have planned for you tonight. Tonight's conversation will be recorded, so and we will be able to view this recording at a later date via the DBDLI's YouTube channel. With this in mind, we kindly ask you to refrain from recording with using your personal device, as a professional recording will be available. We're truly honored to have Nana, Dr. George Sefa Day, with us virtually this evening to share what is a continuation of the presentation that we began at the DBDLI's Afrocentric Conference earlier this spring. The theme of that conference was transformation through Ubuntu. And we are grateful for Dr. Day's for taking this time to share. During that time he shared, and for providing us with a deeper understanding of the Afrocentric philosophy. While the chat function has been disabled right now, we encourage you to engage, and our co-moderators, Dr. Wendy Mackey, who is on there, and Shauna K. Lawrence. They will be following the presentation. They will have a Q&A session. Following the Q&A sessions, they will be prompting you to with question and answers, and I'll ask for you to post your questions in there, and they will read those questions to for a response from Dr. Day. And now I want you to turn your attention to our libation ceremony, which is being presented now.
Thank you, everyone. And wasn't that a beautiful ceremony by the Asokore peoples of Ghana? You saw Dr. Day there in that celebration. My name is Dr. Wendy Mackey, and it's my pleasure to be your moderator this evening. And I know that in our introduction, we had a little bit about Dr. Day, who we will affectionately refer to as Nana this evening, and it is a great blessing. Nana's work informs all of my work in decolonizing educational spaces. There's nothing that I have written where I haven't quoted Nana. And so Professor Day, Ghanaian-born, renowned seminal educator and writer, considered by most people who know, is our foremost Canadian scholar on race, anti-racism studies, Black education, Afrocentric education, African indigeneity, and anti-colonial thought. And we are so pleased with the help of the Deveau Fund that we are able to have this lecture series. And so we'll thank him later on, but I need to thank the Deveau Fund, and Mr. Bill Gunn is online with us tonight, who manages that fund and has made this lecture possible. Professor Day, not only in his own right, Dr. Day, professor, but he also has honorary doctorate from the University of South Africa. Professor Day is a 2015, 2016, 2018, 2019 Carnegie African Diasporan Fellow in August of 2012. Dr. Day also received, he was elected the Fellow of the Royal Society of Canada, the most prestigious award for an academic scholar. He also received the 2016 Whitworth Award for Educational Research from the Canadian Education Association, awarded to the Canadian scholar whose research and scholarship have helped shape Canadian national educational policy and practice. He's also the 2019 Paulo Freire Democratic Project Chapman University U.S. Social Justice Award winner. In April of 2021, Professor Day received the Lifetime Achievement Award from Ontario Alliance of Black School Educators for his longstanding work promoting Black youth education. Professor Day in October 2022 was named the Silver Trust Media as one of the 100 most influential Black Canadians nationwide. In March of 2023, Professor Day has received the highly prestigious 2023 President's Impact Award given to a University of Toronto scholar whose work has reached beyond the walls of academia to significantly impact local communities, national communities, and international communities. Also in April of 2023, Professor Day was given an honorary research associateship in the Center of Excellence in Disabilities from the University of South Africa. Professor Day has 44 books and over 80 referee journal articles to his credit. Finally, in June of 2007, Professor Day was installed as a traditional chief in Ghana of the town of Osokore I'm sorry, I'm not pronouncing these right, New Juaben traditional area of Ghana. His stool name is Nana Aduse Sefa Twenboa. And it is a great honor that we are here tonight to listen to Dr. Day, and just some notes about how tonight will flow. Dr. Day currently is in Ghana, and so because of internet issues, he spent the time and pre-recorded his lecture tonight. Now, Dr. Day is online and will be part of the question and answer afterwards. So we're going to ask, while the recording is going on, if we could make sure that we're all muted. And you might find, because it's a recording, the sound might go down a little bit. And about the chat feature, as we're watching the recording, you might want to note your thoughts, but it won't be until the break time that myself, and I'm so pleased that during the question and answer session, we'll be having a conversation with myself, Nana, and my graduate student, Shauna K. Lawrence, who's also online this evening. And so if during the break, you could put your questions in the chat box, Shauna K. and I will go through them, and we'll try to get as many answered as we can. And so without further ado, you did not come to hear me speak. And so I'm just going to give me a moment, and I will transition into Dr. Day's lecture for this evening.
So I want to begin by recognizing the land on which we are and appreciate all the blessings and the teachings of the land. I also want to acknowledge the ancestors and welcome them into the room for this conversation. And I also want to give thanks. I also want to give thanks to the organizers of this lecture, particularly Delmo Deveau Learning Institute, for having this inaugural lecture. And this is the third in session, and to invite me to speak. Particularly all those who had a hand in organizing this, right from Sylvia, George, Kian, and of course, my graduate student, Seema, and all the media folks who ensure that this event will be highly publicized. Right? I come to this discussion bearing the gifts of knowledge from my ancestors, as the late Maya Angelou would say. And I think it's a blessing to be with all the knowledge that have been imparted to us by our elders and our ancestors. I'm very particularly interested in how we empower Black and African and West Crucian learners and educators to define the challenges that affect our community and how we think through solutions to addressing the problems affecting our community. And in this regard, the whole question of Black solidarities, right? How we think through Black solidarity using our indigenous philosophies become important to my thinking. So there are certain questions, for example, that would guide the way I look at this conversation. One is, how do we as Black and African and West Crucian learners and educators, in the words of Kojoyanka, pioneer new analytical systems for understanding our own communities that are steeped in our own homegrown cultural perspectives? And in this regard too, how do we articulate the nexus of Blackness and Africanness, which is grounded in the Ubuntu philosophy? And I want to speak about the Black African humanhood, which is a sort of knowledge base which is informed by how we strike solidarities, how we build relationalities, how we make connections, and how we build on the mutual interdependence that we have as a people. And we cannot think through this without looking at the convergences of philosophical thoughts like Black centricity, Afrocentricity, and Africentricity in the way they help us to understand the challenges of inclusive education for new futures for our young learners. So I start with the foundations of the Ubuntu philosophy and how they implicate or apply to inclusive education. As we all know, Ubuntu is an Igunu Bantu term for humanity, being self through others. In other words, coming to humanness in relationalities. And as a traditional philosophical thought, we know that the Ubuntu philosophy is a traditional ideology of justice and fairness, and is grounded in indigenous philosophies of, quote, humanness, communitarianism, solidarity, and interdependence, unquote, as articulated by Tamale. Now, there's a saying in Ubuntu that we are human only through the humanity of, with and of others. And Ubuntu espouses certain teachings, which I call the land and earthly teachings. This can be seen as literacies of relationality, sharing, reciprocity, connections, mutual interdependence, building relationships, social responsibility, and accountability to enrich conversations, to subvert, that can be tapped into to enrich conversations, to subvert the colonialities of schooling, and to promote schooling as community, as I've argued elsewhere. Now, while not conflating the sociology of knowledge with critical epistemology, I maintain that Ubuntu philosophy was born out of African struggles, resistance, and liberation. This philosophy is framed within an anti-capitalist, anti-colonial, decolonial lens. And that it is a philosophy of practice that advances critical African scholarship, which is necessary to upend our mental, intellectual enslavement. Ubuntu also acknowledges the dialectics of theory as well as the social practice, the fusion of dialectics of theory and social practice. And it acknowledges also the fact that the African self, the African body, the Black self, is a site, a source, and place of knowing. You know, when it comes to the Black African experience, the question has always been, how do we assert the locus of control over our story? How do we begin to tell our own stories in our own ways, stories about ourselves, how we talk about our identities, our histories, our cultures, and our lived experiences, grounded in our own epistemes, in our own ways of knowing. And this is very, very important. And this is one of the things that we can use the Ubuntu philosophy to think through how we come to understand some of our contemporary problems and the solutions that we need to seek to address them. And in this regard, it's very, very important that as we move along this path, right, that we vocalize our politics, as I've argued with one of my students, Andrea Vakis, right? And when we vocalize our politics, yes, we know that to know is to act, but to us is to act politically, responsibly, and timelessly. That the African educator, the African learner must develop a spiritual remembrance of this Ubuntu feeling that, or Ubuntu saying that I am because we are, and because we are, therefore I am. It's very, very important for that regard, right? Now, how do we move to frame the Ubuntu epistemic challenge as it affects the question of Black education? The search and pursuit of education that makes sense is grounded in our lived existential realities, our cultures and histories. Is very, very important in this regard. We need to find and articulate our centeredness, in the words of Amy Cesare and also Melifia Sanche, in conversations about our Africanness and connect our Africanness to our Blackness as we begin to build this new solidarities for new futures. We also have to espouse an intersectional centric analysis that encapsulates, right, the importance of Black diasporic experience and making historic connections with the motherland. To understand this Blackness as race, but also as a cultural and a political and social historical construction, and to acknowledge Blackness as experienced differently on bodies in different lands, on different geospaces. This is very, very important. The notion of the intersectional centric analysis, the connection with the motherland, Blackness as fused with Africanness, but also hanging on to Blackness as race, but also as a cultural, political, and sociocultural construction, and to acknowledge Blackness in the way it's experienced differently on different lands, on different bodies, and on different spaces. Significantly, the Black African experience in white supremacist context highlights the saliency of race, Blackness, and anti-Blackness as lodged in skin color, but also in body image representation, culture, identity, and politics. We also understand that the Black community itself is not homogeneous. So we need to complicate our understandings of the Black community as complex, as multifaceted, as tension-filled, and as contested. Nonetheless, we still hold on to the power, the spiritual force of coming to a collective African humanhood. And this is something that the Black centricity philosophy as embedded in Ubuntu seeks to articulate. Within global diaspora, and particularly in transnational mobility, we know that the Black experience is always in question and is in, quote, dialectic opposition to Americanness, Europeanness, and Canadianness, as Harris and Baird have long argued. But this is the more reason why we need to be skeptical of those African bodies, Black bodies, who insist that race as color is meaningless, because in their thinking, it serves as a false descriptor. And in their own thinking, that Black is a meaningless category or is an imported label. So they would prefer to talk about the identity of African. Now, I would maintain that this shouldn't be either or. We can talk about Black, we can talk about African, but seek a connection because of their different situatedness and the geographies in which we are, to be able to speak about that connection. So I would interrogate the continuing problem of some Africans strategically distancing or de-racing themselves from Blackness. Because at the end of the day, the dehumanization and racialization of the Black humanhood does not happen solely when Black bodies reach indigenous lands of the Americas or Europe. We see it even on the continent. And it's very, very important for us to connect our understandings of Blackness with Africanness in order to understand this common Black African humanhood that I'm espousing. The colonial dominant has consistently sought to mess us up in terms of our identities, but also our racially politicized identifications. For Black African bodies who fail to question this, I see it as a Black betrayal. I see this as a Black race to innocence, and it's a disavowal of the historic struggles of our ancestors. I want to move on to, because I've been using terms like Afrocentricity, and Black centricity. And I want you to see the convergences, but also engage how we can engage these terms to decolonize questions of curriculum, pedagogy, and our institutions. Monife Asante long ago rightly argued that Afrocentricity is the investigation of social phenomena from the perspective that centers or grounds the African learner in their own research learning. Asante would further argue that Afrocentricity is a mode of thought as well as action, and it is an, quote, enterprise of human regeneration, unquote, that challenges, quote, human supremacist ideas, white supremacist ideas in the imagination of the African world, and by extension, the entire world, unquote, Molefi Asante. Similarly, Ama Mazama, in a quotation by Mulema Karinga, speaks of there are, quote, shared orientations of Afrocentric philosophy, cosmology, zoology, and epistemology, unquote, such as the centrality of community, responsibility, tradition, high levels of spirituality, and ethical concern, harmony with nature, the sociality of selfhood, and the veneration of ancestors and elders as part of the unity of being African. And this, to me, these ideas of Afrocentricity are very, very important. And Afrocentricity works with these ideas, but it builds on this by also highlighting the centrality of the elder crit. That's the cultural values of community, cooperation, mutuality, solidarity, interpersonal relations, ancestral veneration as a derived and informed knowledge base, which is rooted in the material and technological achievements of the ancient African kingdoms and civilizations like Kemet, Nubia, Zimbabwe, Ghana, Mali, Songhai, Dahomey, Asante, Oyo, Yoruba, and etc. So what Afrocentricity does is that it brings in the African elder crit. And the African elder crit highlights some significant teachings. The elder crit of Afrocentricity is grounded on the intertwining notions of life before death, life after death, and the continuation of the world of the living and the world of the dead. In other words, the dead does not leave the living alone, but closely monitors, supervises, and interferes in affairs of the living. Occasionally, the dead returns to the living in the form of the newborn. They believe in the African reincarnations to finish uncompleted tasks. The living understands the inter and the intra relations with the dead. Hence, ancestral veneration is encoded in indigenous African traditions and epistemes. In a shared vein, Black centricity, which I'm espousing, offers a Black diasporic social thought and theorizing as a discursive prism of coming to a Black authenticity wearing no damned white masks. It is a form of radical Black perspectivism that highlights the interplay of race, color, culture, spirituality, politics as significant in analyzing and interpreting the conjoining forces of global diasporic Black and African experiences and existential realities. As a theoretical framing, Black centricity focuses on the search for an explanatory power of the Black diasporic experience through history, through land, through geographies, culture, and politics. As a perspectivism, Black centricity also help provide answers to questions of Black life in global diaspora. The Black body becomes a knower, becomes a thinker, and is also working with an embodied Blackness. And this embodied Blackness can be viewed as an embodied episteme that instructs Black learners to combine study, work, activism, and militancy in the academic and social spaces that we find ourselves. In other words, a form of Black positivity. Black centricity calls for acknowledging the continued significance of the rich heritage of African and Black intellectuality that fuses politics
and advocacy. And I always talk about the question of the power of being an academic warrior. That means for a Black educator, for the educator, the Black learner, you can be nothing else but be an academic warrior. Failure to do that is a betrayal of our ancestors. Our life is about resistance, and we need to work with this. So let me focus a bit more about Black centricity as a framework for centering the Black experience in education. First of all, we need to locate Blackness and Africanness in a specific body of Black diasporic thought and educational practice in Canada. And to insist on Blackness and Africanness that is framed within an indigenous African identity, which is outside of that identity, which has and continues to be constructed within Euro-American hegemony and ideology. The African and the Black learner in the diasporic context must speak from the positionality of our Blackness and Africanness in a white supremacist world, using the body as enflesh and also calling on our spiritual knowings. And I'll borrow the word enflesh for mojito, estahuito. Such training of the Black and African in Black centricity is deliberate. It is intended to register the confluence of race, color, culture, spirituality, history, so as to implicate and invoke and also advocate for global Black radical politics. You see, we need to understand the European creation of Black pathology that Amy Cesare long ago talked about, and Fanon also speaks about this. This Black pathology. The European creation of Black pathology served two purposes. One, it was to justify the subhumanity of Black peoples, Black and African peoples. But two, it was to separate our Blackness from Africanness, so as to reinforce the discourse of white dominance and fascism. So you separate Blackness from Africanness, you deroot and furthers the project of dominance. And as I've argued in many places, and I know Paul Ajay also makes this point, right? The crisis of Blackness in Euro-American context can only be seen as a crisis of memory against forgetfulness. And this crisis of memory against forgetfulness to create a form of Blackness which is devoid of history, is devoid of place, origin, and of spiritual grounding. And let me ground this in some concrete examples. You know, the Cape Coast slave dungeons in Ghana, as well as the House of Slaves on Gorée Island in Senegal, both have the caption on the large door used by millions of Africans who were shipped to North America. And the caption reads, "Door of No Return." For enslaved Africans, the door of no return should be their last glimpse of their African identity. Consequently, enslaved Africans were violently deprived of their cultures, their traditions, their names, their languages, and religions. But this didn't stop there. Relatedly, Africans who stayed behind were similarly deprived of our cultures, our traditions, our names, our languages, and religions through European colonial education and religion. This is a point that Ngugi wa Thiong'o made long ago. Within Euro-American racism lies this advanced form of anti-Blackness that in many ways has sought to encourage diasporic Blacks to reject Africa and embrace Europe and North America. The justification has been, oh, Africa is too far, and diasporic Blacks have no place in Africa to claim as their own. Meanwhile, diasporic Europeans have no problem claiming their Irish, their Italian, their English, and French heritage. We know the King of England still claims seats in governance in Canada and Australia. So it becomes a responsibility on us to ask and address the question, how then do we subvert the project of discouraging diasporic Blacks from claiming their Africanness? And this is why Black centricity advances a mode of thinking and thought grounded in that Ubuntu philosophy. The theological prism of Black centricity embedded in the Ubuntu philosophy affirms the synergy and convergences of Blackness and Africanness for a purposeful reinvention of an Africanness in a diasporic context. Black centricity represents, quote, a counter-white episteme, a mode of knowing and a being that is deconstructive, reconstructive, and transformative, unquote, of what it means to be a Black scholar, paraphrasing Yancey. As a philosophy of thought and method, Black centricity highlights land and earthly teachings lodged within bodies, cultural memories, histories, and ancestral spiritual connections in understanding the African Black humanists. Let me pause here for a second. Okay. Also. I think we need to create educational spaces for learners to engage this our enfleshed knowings. We need to examine the particular discursive lens that we use for our intellectual and political critiques and interrogations while in these spaces. We need to develop a robust epistemological framework for understanding the Black existence and that inseparable connections to the motherland. And we need to re-articulate the relations of racism and its intersectionalities with conceptions of Blackness, Africanness, and the Black existential threat in the face of European white superiority and fascism. We need to explain and devise solutions to the Black learner experience in a white supremacist world. And we need to subvert internalizations of colonial oppressions and colonial relations within our own communities. I think it's very, very important, again, to quote the words of Karinga, that we confront the death of our own intellectual imprisonment and our cultural estrangement, as well as dislocation while in the diasporic context. To do so is to cultivate and pursue and promote Black-centric, Afrocentric, and Afrocentric standpoints as a necessary exercise in our own decolonization. And we need to survey the ways our African truths have, in the words of Paki, always been at the mercy of the fiction of others, unquote. A reframing of Blackness must be approached in ways that do not empower whiteness and white supremacy. And one way we can do this is even to challenge and subvert the consumption and the appropriation of Blackness by corporate capital, as NG talks about. We can also challenge the Blackness that still desires whiteness. Black survival and Black existential realities require dismantling of the ontology of Blackness, which is grounded in a white gaze and white mythologies. But more importantly, too, we need to work with the pedagogical lessons of Black priorities across land and geospaces. This is how we can speak about the multidimensionalities of Blackness, the intersectionalities that I spoke about, but also the cartographies of Blackness. To see the priorities of Black geographies as revealing the different Black resistances, Blesso and Wright, and to resist the dispossession of the Black ontological register by rewriting Black history, claiming Black consciousness as an awareness of our existence and the subversion of the continuing conflation of Blackness with criminality and deviancy. Crucially, we also need to develop a sense of honor to Black life and African life with a renewal of the Black ethos. And we need to articulate in the spaces that we find ourselves what I've called, alongside with my student, Mary Carmen Lavenueva, a speciology of Blacknesses, which is to say that rather than insist that, or even argue that the spaces we find ourselves were not meant for us, we rather insist on making demands when we get into these spaces. Let me shift to the power of community and how this is very important for the articulation and pursuit of our Black scholarship. First of all, you know, there's a saying, it takes a village to raise a child. And I hear people say that all the time, right? People here always say the time. Sometimes I wonder whether they understand what the African proverbial saying actually means. Of course, it takes a village to raise a child. But the fact is that you must have the village in the first place. In other words, you must work to create the village. That's what the proverb is saying. So it's not simply it takes a village. You must create the village. And we create the village by building communities. Despite our contestations, despite our tensions, despite our differences, we'll build communities. And we build these communities one brick at a time. We know that within our communities, we find our spiritual and emotional backbone. And this backbone sustains us in wherever we find ourselves, both in our intellectual and political process. And this is why it's so important that communities, creating, working communities become important for us as educators, as learners, as students. And it is important also that we don't put our communities under the bus. That if our communities spiritually rejuvenate us, revive us, support us, that we do not put them under the bus in furtherance of our own careers. Our work must be about social relevance to our communities. Our work must be about paying debt to our communities. By sustaining us, we owe great debt to our communities, and we need to pay those debts by making our work relevant. We only make our work relevant when we articulate and eschew the dialectic of Black scholar and Black scholarship. There cannot be an independence of a Black scholar and Black scholarship. Black scholar and Black scholarship have to be in tandem. They have to work in hand. That the Black scholar must be preoccupied with Black scholarship. And it's herein that we can articulate this reframing of Black authenticity as Black skin with no marks. And in defining this role of the Black educator and learner, we would like to propose a Black repositioning or an authentic repositioning rather than a critical repositioning in the work of Haddon. This authentic repositioning helps Black learners to redefine our intellectuality in the collective global Black struggle. It's an authentic repositioning. In other words, the designation of, quote, Black must mean something special. It must be a scholarly calling, a political quest that embodies the true meaning of Blackness as resistance, as resilient, and as authentic. There also has to be an unapologetic, that audacious, and that holistic understanding of Blackness, a desire to speak with a distinctive Black voice, a discursive politics that oppose the African spirit, the soul, the body, the mind, in a moment in history when Blackness is under attack, given the ongoing necropolitics, to quote the words of actually Mbembe. The intellectual politics of the Black learner must draw on history, must draw on our cultures, our cultural, psychic, spiritual memories, using an abolitionist frame of thought and advancing a common Black African humanhood. Our work must interrogate our institutions, schools, media, justice system, etc., as carceral places with dehumanizing effects on Black mental psyche and well-being. These places are carceral places, and we must interrogate them as carceral places. Our resistance, our educational resistance, is the only way to reclaim this Black authenticity and to subvert the power and weight of the white colonial gaze. We cannot become products of our institutions. We cannot become products of our institutions. In other words, we cannot be intellectual imposters in the words of Namno, but rather we must become products of our own decolonization and resistance. In the words of Martin and Hani, it's important for us to see our institutions, our schools, as places and spaces for radical and speculative images, a place for us to be in, but not of. In other words, we have every right to be in these spaces, but we should not let these spaces make us who we are. This means embracing a politics of, quote, fleeing without living. And this is a politics where we flee from the carceral logics of these places without leaving the possibilities of creating critical spaces in which to work to subvert and to transform and to abolish. Again, Hani and Morton. Let me say a few words about integrating the inclusive education promise and fail. There is an ongoing and very, very legitimate critique of the institutional performances, the expectations, and the commitment rhetoric, the lack of accountability and policies that are put in place but have no teeth on them. For example, we know that equity, diversity, and inclusion, which is pursued through that inclusive educational model, has often been a distraction for its race evasiveness, for its colorblind ideology, and the inability to name anti-Blackness, anti-indigeneity, and white supremacy. There is this feeling that sometimes these inclusive education initiatives are only served as appeasement to Black and Indigenous bodies. And I think it's a point that Ronaldo Walcott also makes. These approaches enable the dominant, again here to quote Biko Mandela Gray, to do, quote, a penance and have their conscience cleansed, unquote. and be on a path of redemption, which in many ways is an approach that only gets in the way of true liberation. Therefore, we must be critical of the rhetorical appeals to whiteness in the pursuit of inclusive education. There are rhetorical appeals to whiteness in the pursuit of inclusive education. Inclusion into what? It's a question we must ask. But we must also ask the question, what schools do we want and are willing to fight for? We must begin by having the difficult conversations prior to doing this inclusive education work. Where is the institutional commitment? It cannot just be rhetorics. Where are the resources to back it up? We must also understand that there are structural and ideological changes that are required, they are prerequisites in order to pursue inclusive, anti-racist, anti-colonial changes that we want in our schools. So how do we go for this interrogation? And here I want to delimit the critical boundaries for African versus Scotian learners in the search for inclusive education. Inclusion should be about starting anew. It should embrace the diversity of thought. It's not just having diverse bodies. Inclusion should also be about working with our different communities. The Black community is not homogeneous. It's heterogeneous. So working with our different communities. Thirdly, we need to tap into the rich history of community-rooted activism. There are important lessons in community-rooted activism, grassroots organizing, militancy, for their lessons and the critique for how institutions have been co-opted or how institutions have co-opted equity, anti-racism, and inclusive educational strategies. In Nova Scotia, there are numerous historic community educational work that we can draw on for their lessons for how we approach radical inclusive education. We know of the work of the Black Learners Advisory Committee, the African Baptist Association, the Black Educators Association, the United Front, the Black Lawyers Heritage Center, the Black Business Initiative, the Black Cultural Center for Nova Scotia, the Africville Museum, and of course, the Deveau Body Dale Learning Institute. We need also to deploy the philosophical teachings embedded in the Ubuntu philosophy for this radical, subversive, inclusive educational process. These teachings that are grounded on the land, the teachings, the land teachings, the relationality, the reciprocity, the sharing, the connections. Classroom teachings must focus on the white gaze and how it continues to erase the Black body, Black experiences, and Black existential realities. Such teachings must focus on Black subjectivities in ways that allow our learners to connect to African and to our Africanness. These teachings must affirm Black counter-narratives, as well as how we tell our own stories. There must be a focus on teachings of the land. And this is beyond the cartographies, to insist on our different relations to the land. We have different relations to the land. Some are about disconnections, some are about displacement, some are about dislodging, as well as acknowledging and purging ourselves of the ongoing violence on lands. These teachings must focus on Black subjectivities in ways that allow learners to connect to Africa, the motherland, and to connect to our Africanness. It must affirm Black counter-narratives, and it must be a pedagogy of the geographies of schooling, which would require that we connect to these teachings of the land. The connections with the land is very important because it allows us to appreciate our different very relations to the land, as I mentioned, the disconnections, the displacement, the dislodging. But it also allows us to bring a critical reading of our existence on lands, which is to say we must work to address the ongoing violence on the lands on which we find ourselves. When we get lost on the land, when we don't do these connections to the land, when we don't reclaim our connections to the land, our ties to the land, we lose the body, the mind, the soul, and the spirit. But we also fail to draw on the power of our emotional, physical, and psychic connections with ourselves, with nature, and with our environments. At the end of the day, we are talking about our indigenous identities. These are about the connections with emotional, psychic, and physical relations to nature, with environments. It is who we are as a people. In teaching about Blackness, we have to seek the connections with indigeneity and bring a radical relationality to Blackness and indigeneity. In other words, Blackness is about relationality. And in speaking about Blackness and indigeneity in relationalities, we're able to speak about dislocations, dispossessions, the intersections of bodies and labor on lands and geospaces. These are things that other scholars have also written about: Harris, Baird, Robin Maynard, Tiffany Keene, and many others. In teaching Blackness, as Blake also cautions us, there must be a corresponding focus on trauma-free Blackness, where we pay attention to aspects of Black life, joy, and happiness, not just the pain and suffering. In other words, to also move beyond, not away, move beyond the relentless and the persistence of Black grief and anguish. It's not an either or. We can talk about Black life, Black joy, but also talk about Black pain and suffering in that context. That is understanding Blackness as existing outside of trauma. Black life that is not filtered solely through the lens of racism, but Black life that is also through celebrations of music, arts, literature, sports, celebration of culture and community. And in teaching about Blackness, we must hang on to this imperative of a Black-white prism. Not a Black-white paradigm, but a Black-white prism. The Black-white prism is a lens, it's a perspective for reading society, that everywhere on the global landscape, a closer proximity to whiteness is rewarded, while conversely, a proximity to Blackness is punished. This is globally everywhere. So moving away from a Black-white binary should not mean that we don't work with a Black-white prism, because the Black-white prism is a powerful lens for reading society everywhere. So in conclusion, let me reiterate a couple of points. One of the things I'm talking about Black centricity as the power of Black social thought, particularly in the Black diasporic context, is reasserting this Black and African consciousness. But this consciousness is meaningless without action, as Fanon long time ago told us. Second, it's also very important for us to theorize Africa beyond its boundaries. Africa is not just a physical space. Africa is a spiritual, it's a psychic, it's emotional, it's a psychological space. And we must, excuse me, we must articulate Africa beyond its physical boundaries. In other words, there is an Africanness which is rooted on the continent, but there's an Africanness that can also be located in the body, and it travels beyond time and space in psychic and in cultural memories. The very familiar saying that one is African not because he or she was born on the continent, but because Africa was born in the person. Black centricity requires embracing Africanness as a political resistance and as a retracing of our histories, our cultures, and identities to Africa. Black centricity, like Afrocentricity, becomes an omnicentric prism, one which is holistic. It is attuned to relational spheres with more than humans, relation to our environments, and it challenges the anthropocentric ideologies and the prevailing colonial architectures of Western science knowledge. Black centricity, Afrocentricity, and Afrocentricity must be seen as epistemologies of decolonization and as metaphors of resistance, with the implicit realization that decolonization cannot happen solely through Western science scholarship. This is why we need other perspectives if we are going to decolonize. And that these perspectives also must be embedded, particularly for us as African peoples, in the Ubuntu philosophy, which I have articulated, but particularly for the grammar of Black educational futurity that it offers us, which is a grammar that strives and lives for the future now, in the present, with lessons of the past to guide us in the search for new futures. In other words, the past, the present, and the future, and are in spiral relationalities, back and forth, spiral relationalities. It's not a linear progression. We don't move from the past to the present to the future. The past, the present, and the future are fused, and this will offer a grammar of educational futurity in the pursuit of radical education for our learners. This is why, for example, in teaching African history, it must be about reclaiming the past, reflecting on the present, and projecting onto the future. Reclaiming the past, reflecting on the present, and projecting onto the future. And in the words of Kiswahili, as we say, Asante sana. Thank you.
Dr. Day, you brought us to church. I'm going to ask everybody to turn their mics on for a quick second. And you know what we say when we're in church and somebody gives us the word. On the count of 3. 1, 2, 3.
Amen.
Amen.
Amen. Amen.
Amen.
Amen. Thank
My
you.
God.
Amen.
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 We're going to allow just a quick 10-minute break. If you have questions, now is the time to put them in the chat. And we're going to check those questions out when we return. Myself and Shauna K. Lawrence, we're going to have a conversation with Dr. Day, and then we're going to open it up to questions. If you have any questions you want to throw in the chat, do so. It is now 7:13 and we will be starting exactly at 7:23. I'm going to take a quick break. Amen.
The Delmore Buddy Day Learning Institute is focused on community engagement, working with youth. We also have the added value of providing published resources, and those are used in the public school system. And that process is really important because that's when voices are centered.
Here at DBDLI, all of our work is focused through community, through our youth workshops, through publishing, through research, even through holding this public space here for the community. Our research and youth department are dedicated to better understand the educational challenges that our Black learners face here in Nova Scotia. We meet those challenges through community engagement, resources, youth programming, and research projects. A great example of our community engagement is our annual African Nova Scotian History Challenges. Students from across the province submit projects focused on African Nova Scotian leaders, activists, and communities.
The real niche piece for us is participatory action research. We are about community voice, and setting ways for it to be heard.
All right, welcome back, everyone. And what a great evening it is. And for all of the scholars and the students, and I'm speaking directly to my Black students that are online today. In Nana's presentation, he said the designation Black means something special. And we need to ensure all of our Black students feel and know and understand that they are special. And for our Black scholars and researchers on the line today, you know, one of the things that I'm so appreciative, Nan, is my whole career, I have been centered, and my work has been centered in Blackness and doing what's right for Black children. And I am unapologetically doing that. Throughout my career, I have been, people have tried to persuade me to, you know, connect other people and other things and other groups into my work. But I let everybody know, if we are doing right by Black children, we do right by all. And so I say that unapologetically. And in your presentation, you said that as Black scholars, we have to be unapologetic, audacious. We have to understand and see it as a holistic education for all of us, and have a desire to speak with a distinctive Black voice. And so what you've done is you've confirmed our work. You've confirmed our work for us and given us, I don't want to say permission, but letting us know we are on the right track and we are doing the work we are supposed to do. And working in education is discursive politics. And so I speak from a Nova Scotian perspective, born and raised, and very proud to say I'm African Nova Scotian. And speaking from an African Nova Scotian perspective, when we look at what's happening in our schools, whether they be primary through 12, kindergarten, pre-K through 12, and in higher education, we are working within, I liked what you said, you know, in the colonial majority. And I know even for myself in higher ed, I'm the only African Nova Scotian on my campus. This year, I'm very grateful. We actually have another Black professor that has joined us. And of course, he's from Ghana. And in our work, we find ourselves being unapologetically Black and in those discursive spaces where we need to speak, because if not us, then who?
Yes.
And
Yes.
so when we think about the work that needs to be done, and in terms of being inclusive, so that I love what you said in terms of being inclusive, we really need to scrap it, and we need to start from the beginning.
Yeah.
Because we were never included in the first place.
Mm-hmm.
And so when we think about discursive politics, in all of our policies, including our inclusive education policy, where Black and African Nova Scotian and being culturally relevant are mentioned 18 times in the whole policy. And everything that we look at, whether it be the organizations that are dedicated to ensuring that our Black people remain are seen as the brilliant bodies that we are. But when we look at the policies, when we look at our institutions, when we look at anything that sort of targeted for us, comes at a deficit.
Yeah.
It does not look at us, and in terms of our inclusive education policy, as a deficit. We are a people that require support. We are a people that require interventions. We are not a people that are seen, written on paper or in our schools, as the brilliant people that we are. And so
Yeah.
my question to you is, how can the organizations, and you listed them all off in your presentation, because Nova Scotia is special in the fact we can't go to any other province and see all of those organizations that are government funded. But how can we work together to make sure that the work we're doing does not come as a deficit because of, like you said, and I always say in my work, I don't care if you're Black, white, purple, green, or polka dotted, we all came up and we all were educated within this colonial system. So it's been ingrained in us that we are other. And from a Black body to think that we are other, right, is a shame. So what advice would you give to our organizations so that we can operate from what we know as the brilliant Black body instead of people who need intervention? And I hope
Yeah. No, that's Wendy, that's a very important question. And I think it's this issue about look, it all comes from where we start at, right? And starting with our knowledge base, right? And I think one of the things when you look at these organizations, these are all, we have communities towards people who have a history, right, of fighting resistance, right? And they come into this politics with that. They come into these associations with that knowledge, right? So tapping into that wealth of knowledge, which is not from a deficit model, I think in many ways is challenging the status quo, right? And so working with that. And so when you talk about how do we move forward, it's how we share these histories, how we share the lessons, how we share the struggles, how we share the resistances that we have encountered in order to move forward, right? And I think to me, the power of community is our ability to connect with each other, right? We create communities, but communities must also work together, right? And it's not something which it's not an easy thing, right? Because of sometimes we live in a system where we are set up to compete with each other. We are set up to actually be in sort of that mode. And it's very, very important for us to step outside of that, right? And look at how community, the ethos of community, which is embedded in our knowledge systems, allow us to come together and work on our strengths, to think through solutions. And like we said, if not us, who is going to do it for us, right? We have to develop our own path. And that's why when we talk of, say, elders in our communities, right? Elder is not simply just by age. It's about how people perceive what you've done within the community, right? And I mentioned the point about where sometimes some of us in the advancement of our careers, we put our communities under the bus, right? So rather than create communities, rather than mentor the young ones, right? We see ourselves in competitive mode, and that has been to our detriment in that. And I also wanted to mention one point where you started off with, I mean, the designation of Black, right? You know, sometimes you hear people talk about, I don't want to be called a Black scholar, I want to be called a scholar, right? I don't want to be known as a Black scholar. Look, we need to be proud of our identities to be called a Black scholar, right? To me, it's a badge of honor because in academia, to be a scholar in academia is going through the trenches, right? It's in war, being in war and being in struggle, and we need to deal with that, right?
Dr. Mackey, your mic is muted.
Amazing. Thank you, Shauna. Okay. And one of the things that I heard, and that I hope the message can be spread out, we as African Nova Scotians and all of our organizations that are all funded by the same government, they're all provincially funded. We have to remember the money might come from the government, but we as a people need to
Yes.
designate how we work together, and how we and work as that community. And so I so appreciate that. And I just want to turn it up. And by the way, so Shauna K. Lawrence is a master's student who's completing her master's thesis, and she's also a Delmore Buddy Day Learning Institute scholar. And so we need to thank DBDLI for helping Shauna K. complete her education. And I'm going to turn the mic over to you, Shauna K.
Thank you very much, Dr. Mackey. Thank you again to the DBDLI for all the support that you have been providing for me throughout this journey. And it was a pleasure listening to your presentation, Dr. Sefa Day. I've referenced your work so many times in my literature after being introduced to your work by Dr. Mackey. I just want to make some comments in regards to what I'm doing in regards to my own research, and then I have a question for you. So
Right.
at the moment, my thesis is exploring pedagogical practices that best support the academic success of Black students in rural Nova Scotia. I'm very proud of the work that I've been doing so far and the guidance that Dr. Mackey has been providing as I go through this journey. Some of the things that you mentioned in your presentation that stood out to me and really resonated with the work that I'm doing as a researcher. You said that when it comes to Black or African experience, the question has always been, how do we assert the locus of control in regards to our story, and how our stories are told about
Right.
ourselves, and how this is represented throughout teaching. And the essence of my thesis, as I said, it really focuses on the voice and the story of African Nova Scotia students, and how this is shared to the public. I'm very, very interested in their perspective. And as a classroom teacher for 5 years, or when I was in the classroom, that was the main calling for me in regards to why I went into research, because I realized that the voices of African Nova Scotia students need to be heard, and their stories are so important. And if as teachers, our goal is to ensure that our practices meet their needs, they're the ones who know exactly what they need as students, and we have to provide opportunities for their voices and their perspectives to be heard, because that's the only way we're going to know what the changes are, and meaningful and intentional changes in regards to curriculum practices and pedagogical practices to meet their needs.
Yeah.
You also spoke about the challenges of Black education and the experiences of Black students, and how oftentimes for them it's experienced in a different way. So their experiences as a diverse group of students is it definitely differs from what we're seeing in the classroom, where they're surrounded with students from different groups. So I was thinking about that, and I also linked it to an article that you wrote in 2018, where you talked about diverse learners and their experiences, and how this is something that teachers need to be mindful of in their classroom and their practices. Because like you said in the article, now more than ever, we're seeing how in classrooms we are experiencing diversity, and the needs of these students are changing. So that's something that educators need to be mindful of when they're thinking about their planning and thinking about how they're going to make sure that they meet the needs of these diverse students. The question I have, but then I have one more point. The question that I have here is thinking about the idea of Ubuntu and how it's centered in our practice. How can educators embed Ubuntu into their practice to ensure that they're meeting the needs of diverse students?
Yeah. No, I think one of the key principles of Ubuntu philosophy is around the question of the teachings of the land, right? So it comes around these questions of relationality, community building, reciprocity, sharing, those ideas, because it's about interconnections, right?
Yes.
And this is why educators need to work with that mindset, which moves away from the competitive, the individualistic mode, right? How do we build relations in the classrooms? How do we build communities in the classrooms? How do we ensure that, look, the learners in the classroom see that each other's success is our collective success.
Yes.
And similarly, each other's failure is our collective failure, right?
Mm.
There's so much of, well, this child is doing well and that child is failing. Too tough luck for the one who is failing, right? Forgetting that sometimes it's the system, right, that puts people in those positions. And I think bringing that Ubuntu philosophy which says that we are all in this, right? We are
Yes.
connected, right? The failure speaks for all of us. That student's failure is our failure, just as that student's success is our success. That there's
Yes.
something like individual success, there's that collective sense of success and the collective sense of failure. And we have to work with that mindset and bringing that philosophy into. And then the other philosophy is about the humanness, right? That seeing the humanity of the learner, right? That the learner standing there is not just a name, right? It's somebody with life, somebody with body, mind, soul, and spirit, right? And seeing that humanity is very, very important because it relates to how that learner is treated, right? If you believe in the humanity, right, of the learner, right, it has implications for how you treat or how you relate with that with that learner in that sense. I want to come back to the point we made earlier about the power of telling our stories, right?
Yeah.
I think we need to restore our lives, right?
Mm.
Black lives have in many cases been storied by others. The audacity to think they know us more than we know ourselves, right?
Mm-hmm.
And we need to restore our own lives, right? And restoring our own lives is telling our own stories,
Yes.
right? Telling our own stories. That doesn't mean that telling our own stories, we're going to tell the gospel ones. We need to tell our stories in all the different shades, the different sizes and different forms, right? But we have the power. We are set the locus of control in telling those stories. And this is why we need to empower our learners to come to voice, as Bell Hook talks about, right?
Yep.
To be able, right? I mean, I speak in my career. I know some of my graduate students, and I know Fiona from my doctoral students is on the line, right? Sometimes we talk about it in the school classrooms where somebody says, well, going to Nana's classroom, the Black, racialized indigenous students speak a lot. And I've said, good, because they're in spaces where they don't just take up, right? And so when they come to those spaces and speak out, this is the question about vocalizing our politics, right? And being allowed to vocalize that politics is very, very important in that regard. And yeah.
Thank you. You mentioned the connectedness of community as well, and that
Mm-hmm.
power of coming together,
Yeah.
which in essence is what Ubuntu is about.
Yeah.
And the whole idea of community that
Yeah.
also resonated with because I did my focus group with my African Nova Scotia students, and one of the things that they said that they want to see more of is that community piece.
Yeah.
And they spoke about the importance of parents being involved in their education, Black teachers being involved in their education, and other educators, which
Mm-hmm.
sometimes, educators in general take for granted, how this whole idea of Ubuntu means that we're all working together to ensure that our practices and policies even are, meeting the needs of our students. So one of the things that I wrote down is that, like I said, my Black students were very, very vocal, and I was very, very happy that I started this journey of research to hear their perspective. And I'm excited about, completing this work with Dr. Mackey and sharing, because their stories, like you said, their stories are so important. Their voices are so important. Their perspectives are so important. And I firmly believe that if we want to see change in education, we have to take the time out to listen to what our students or Black students have to say, because they are the ones who are being affected by all these policies that are being, enforced in schools. But where are their voices? We can't expect to see change if our students are not a part of the conversation when it's their education that's being affected. So the idea of community was really, really big in my focus group and just the discussion, and it just ties in well to what you have said about the importance of community.
Right. Yeah.
Awesome, Shauna Kay. By the way, I didn't pay Shauna Kay to say nice things about me. Put that out there. And I think really it boils down to, Dr. Day, what you said. Until everybody in the building
Yeah.
sees the African Black student in their humanhood,
Yeah.
unless
Yeah.
we are seen as human,
Yeah.
nothing will be done. And in the
Yeah.
work that I do, it's about opening the eyes to show educators, well, the way you're treating students, you're robbing them of their dignity. And
Yeah.
then they've internalized that. I'm going
Yeah.
to turn the mic over to, first, I also wanted to, speaking of Black scholars, and I won't be able to mention everybody because I can't say everybody's names, but just to welcome other Black scholars in the room, Dr. Ingrid Waldron, Dr. Kesa, Dr. Kesa Monroe, is with us, and I'm sure there's others that I can't see their names, but I'm gonna I'm going to turn it over to Sylvia, and then Dr. Susie.
Okay. Dr. Wendy, are you turned over to me because I put something in the chat?
Yes, I figured the question would be better coming from your voice.
Thank you. Okay. Nana, they made it, it's a dangerous place when you gave me space. Because I need to just throw out the love and the respect that I have for you. I need to say that amongst everyone. Thank you so much for being with us all in this learning journey. So what I put in the question in the chat was, do you feel that tracing our identities to locations/countries in Africa, in the continent, and other diasporic locations will strengthen us?
Yeah, I agree in the power of identity, right? I think, and it's not just simply being able to trace your identity to a particular location, but what does that mean, right? What is the history of that place, right? And working with that. And I think to me, there's a strength in being able to do that, right? I talk about this sometimes with anytime I take students to Ghana, right? And I do take students to Ghana as well, right? One of the emotional moments is when these students, the plane touches down at Accra Kotoka Airport, right? And you see their eyes swelling with tears, right? It's about, again, coming back to roots, right? And that. And it's very, very strengthening, right? That they're rooted, right? One of the things when I remember when we talk about the Black pathology, right? One of the things about Black pathology is the rootedness, right? That we are not anchored anywhere. And so to ground our learners, right, is part of that reclaiming of identity. And that reclaiming of identity is very important. And I think to me it's a strength, right? Because they begin to know that they are not a ruthless people, right? They are grounded people. They are people with a history. They are people with a base, right? They are people with a rich tradition, right? And are able to articulate it. And the other thing about identity affirmation also is that it can also be spiritual. It can also be emotional. It can also be not necessarily physical, right? So to give you an example of that, right? People talk about, look, Africa never leaves you. You may leave Africa, but it never leaves you, right? And but what I mean is that there's always the African in us, right? It's our responsibility to let it birth, to let it come out, right? And sometimes some of us try to hide it, some of us try to cover it, right? But being able to let it birth, come to birth, to come out in the open, right? It to me is a strength because it shows that you have a sort of identity affirmation that you want to affirm, and it's very, very important in one's journey. And being able to do that is very, very important. There's a reason, right? Why, say, we have mothers, say, would go to Lakeshore in Ontario, right, to pour libation, right? Look, they are pouring libation to what? They are pouring libation to the ancestors. And the reason is that they will tell you, right, that as far as we're concerned, our ancestors who lost their lives when they were thrown overboard in the seas, right? When you throw something overboard in the seas, it swims, it floats. So as far as we're concerned, they might have swum and come to Lakeshore, right? So we are pouring libation to make that connection with the land, right? This is why in one of the PowerPoints, I was making the point about when we lose that connection with the land, right? And that connection with the land is not just physical, it's emotional and psychological, right? When we lose that connection with the land, we lose our soul, we lose our spirit, we lose our mind in that sense. So that affirmation is very, very important. I believe strongly in the power because the colonizers did a dirty job on identity and language, right? And so anytime we get a movement to reaffirm our identities, that is a strength in that.
Thank you so much. And you're right. I mean, we sort of know as a people, we can feel it. When we feel Africa within us, when we feel that specialness about us, when we can say, I'm Black, and that's a wonderful thing. Like we feel that and tracing that back. I'm gonna turn the mic over to another one of our Black scholars. I don't know where she is in my Zoom look, but Dr. Susie Brigham.
Hi, yes, Susie.
Oh, hello.
Hi.
Hi. Nice to see you, Dr. Day.
Yes.
I had a quick question. Sorry, I think there's a bit of an echo, but I apologize for that. Oh, I can turn the mic off? Oops. Okay, sorry about that. It's just,
Oh, you've gone mute.
maybe you mute yours.
Yes, the other person should mute theirs because we can hear them.
Okay, here we go. Okay, so I wondered if you could say something more about the need for authentic repositioning rather than critical repositioning.
Yeah.
So can the repositioning be both authentic and critical?
Oh, yes.
And shouldn't criticality require being authentic and vice versa?
Yeah.
And then what's required to know that we're speaking from an authentic Black voice, especially as we are steeped in ideologies?
Yeah, let's start with the question of the critical positioning and then the authentic repositioning, right? I think I will draw the distinction precisely because you can have a critical positioning and repositioning without being authentic, right? And we have a lot of that. I call that the fake radicals, right? There's a lot of fake radicalism that goes around, right? When the push comes to shove, they are nowhere to be found, right? So they like to mouth off, right? So that's a critical positioning. But to be authentic is to be true to oneself, right? That this is what you believe in. You stand strongly before that. So to respond to your question, yes, you can have both, a critical and authentic. But for the most part, or no, I shouldn't say for the most part, so there are parts where people have this critical position and repositioning, which is not necessarily based on authenticity. It's about performances, right? They're doing it. Basically, we think there's a requirement to do that. So yes, we can have the critical and we can have the authentic, but I want to talk more about the authentic repositioning. The authentic repositioning calls for one sense, understanding what it means to be Black, what it means to be a Black scholar, right? And what it means to be authentic, about that claiming. That's the notion about there's something about to be called Black. There's something about it. It's about there's a history behind it. It's a history of resistance. It's a history that name, right, must conjure up certain things that one has to live up to. And that's what I mean by that authentic positioning, right? Because otherwise, sometimes we can get into this zone where we are only critical, but we serve the critical as simply an intellectual exercise, right? Without being authentic to who we truly are in terms of our soul, spirit, body, and mind in that sense, right?
Yes, that makes a lot of sense. Thank you very much.
Sure.
Dr. Brigham, thank you so much for that question. And because we often see, Black by convenience sometimes.
Yeah.
We critically position ourselves when it can benefit us.
Yeah.
But when we do that work, like you said, nobody can be found. And so I love that adding that authenticity onto our positionality. And so thank you so much. And we do have time for one more question.
There's somebody in the chat. I think it's Moshala. Sorry if I pronounced your name wrong. They were saying they have a question.
Okay, go ahead, Moshala.
Hi, good evening, everyone. Thank you. I was just thinking back to so many great bits tonight. I'm super grateful to be here. But when you were talking about how important it is for Blacks across the diaspora to claim their Africanness,
Yeah.
right? And 2 years ago, I had the great fortune to work with a group of young people on a cross-continental project, and we had two young artists from North Preston. We had two from Ghana, two from Zimbabwe, and two from St. Vincent in the Caribbean. And I can't tell you what all of the benefits of that project. And I was mostly interested in how that was impacting our learners from North Preston to be able to engage with Blacks from other parts of the world in their homeland.
Yeah.
I think very often there's lots of opportunities for us to engage with others when they come here to where we are. And that's a very different experience. But in terms of getting a sense of how much we are the same, how much we're cut from the same cloth, is that opportunity to engage with people in where they feel most at home. And, you know, just there was so many great moments where I could see them going, wow, okay, yeah, we are the same. We have so much to learn from each other. And we want more of this. Like, I just wanted to comment on that, but also to throw it out to the educators who are here in Nova Scotia. That happened virtually. It didn't cost us that much. Like, it's just a call out for us to do more of that for our African Nova Scotia learners or our Black learners who are here in this province. Give them chances to connect with others across the diaspora. Give them an authentic opportunity to connect in a way where because there's othering that's happening between us
Exactly.
too, right?
Exactly.
And so this is a chance, learners at all levels, we can connect. There's Teams, there's Zoom, there's all sorts of ways, and I'm seeing even on this call, there's people from not just here. So there's already network that's been connecting. Let's get our learners to experience each other, regardless of where they are across the diaspora. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you. And I think your question in many ways also connected to Sylvia's earlier question, which is the strength in claiming identities, right? That's this reinvention of Afrikaners in the diaspora context is very important, right? Because part of, as I said, part of that Black pathology was to basically separate us from that connection, right? And we need to make that connection, create it, reclaim it, right? Because when you deroot a people, when you de-anchor a people, right, it's easier for them to see them as people who are not grounded, right? And it serves the interests of Black pathology, right? And I think it's very, very important for us to think about ways that we can reinvent our Africanness in the diasporic context, right? And because that itself is very, very helpful to allow people to claim a sense of who they are and that sense of that authentic self and that.
Amazing, amazing. Thank you, Moshella. And just to bring back to one of the points that you said, connected to Nana's presentation, when you first started off, and I believe this was in the clip that we showed from your presentation from the summertime, when we talk about Ubuntu, when we talk about us as a people, I am because we are because, when we think about it, we together, and because you brought us together tonight, Nana, we are that spiritual force that you spoke about.
Yeah.
We are that spiritual force. And can you imagine if all of us on this call from the diaspora get together and in this work, we represent what you're talking about, but we have to move beyond the once a year Zoom calls, and we have to, once every other year Afrocentric conferences. And we do have to pool our sources because, like you said, we can talk about it takes a village all we want, but we need to build that village brick by brick, and we need to start with ourselves, wherever we find ourselves, and wherever we were born into the diaspora, for us to be together. Because we are, and because of you, I know that I am, and the rest of the scholars on here. And for this evening, you have brought us together in the spirit of Ubuntu. And we do not have enough thanks on this Zoom call to give you. The wisdom that was just shared, I just hope that we can all understand, to know, and to act, and to be, and to have that political responsibility to move this work forward and not bow down to the white supremacist spaces that we belong to. When we do things because that's the way it's always been done, and when we do things because that's the way they're doing it, and we're trying to see where we can fit in, we have to remember we don't have to fit into their world.
Yeah.
We do not have to fit into their world. We need to share who we are with them, but we are not below. And so with that spiritual force, and here, as you said, go out there and I'd like everybody to make sure that they proclaim their specialness, proclaim their Black greatness wherever you are. Make sure people know who you are. And this has been amazing. This annual lecture could not be possible without the Deveau Foundation. I need to thank the Deveau Foundation, the Deveau Trust, and Miss Janine Deveau, who donated her money so that, because she was tired of seeing Black people being othered. And she entrusted her nephew, Bill Gunn, and Bill Gunn is here. And I know that the Deveau Fund personally has helped me in gaining my PhD. I owe a lot to the Deveau Fund. If people want to know how they can get involved with the Deveau Fund, just so you know, the Deveau Fund gives every African Nova Scotian student who comes to St. FX a scholarship. And then if students are maintaining their grades, they get a scholarship every year until they graduate. When you donate to the Deveau Fund, your funds are matched by the trust itself. And then we have a separate one, scholarship for any Black person going into education that was born in Nova Scotia. And so the fact that Bill Gunn continues to help us, I can't say enough about that. I need to thank all of the staff of Delmore Buddy Day Learning Institute, especially Kay-Ann Scott. The amount of hours that she has put in to making this lecture happen is quite amazing and quite astounding. So Kay-Ann, I don't know if you can put on your camera so we can see who you are, but the work you've done, I mean, and internationally, working with Dr. Day while he was in Toronto, then working with Dr. Day on the time zones while he's in Ghana. The work that you've done, Karen Ann, is amazing. Thank you to Randy Delory, who opened us up this evening. Of course, Sylvia Paris. I just want to let everybody know that there will be a brief survey that goes out in the coming days. So look for our survey. We encourage you to fill it out because your comments are going to help us to grow. On behalf of myself and my student, Shauna Kay, we can't give you enough love, Nana. I mean, you're amazing. You inspire me. Like every time I hear you, I want to then go now. I need to go write a paper because you just inspire me so much. And on behalf of everybody that took time out of this very busy time of year for joining us, thank you so much. And we'd all like to wish you happy holidays, Merry Christmas, Happy Kwanzaa. Dr. Day, I know it's getting late there in Ghana. Thank you so much.
Sure.
And can we all just have a round of applause for Dr. Day, please? Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thanks, Nana.
Thank you,
Thank
Nana.
you. Thank you.